Hello and welcome to the next lecture on the course Introduction to Autonomous Systems. In the last lecture, we talked about the basic difference between automation and autonomous systems, and towards the end we came to the conclusion that the system to become autonomous will require an important human skill of thought, or what we might also call intelligence. In this session, we are now going to introduce the idea of intelligence as a human attribute and see some of its very basic features that are to be considered for implementation in any machine that aims to become autonomous. So, let us begin today's session. So, let us first talk about concept of intelligence itself. Intelligence as a word has been in our consciousness for so long that we accept it as something that is there and does not need any further elaboration. For example, if I tell that somebody is very intelligent, everybody understands. The problem is, do they understand in the right context or correctly? And that is where the issues are going to become multifold. But at least on the surface we realize that if anybody says intelligence, we all get an impression in our mind as to what we intend. In fact, if you go back and look at our description as Homo sapiens, that translates as man the wise. The intelligence is integral to our description or definition as humans, which means intelligence is something which is internal to all our existence, and for that reason we take intelligence for granted. Of course, we have also realized over a period of time that it is a complex concept, has multiple manifestations, all of them are equally valid, and that is where the challenge is going to be to bring that idea to a level of clarity that it can be implemented in a machine. Of course, there is also a reasonable evidence from various theoretical and experimental studies to show that intelligence is a complex combination of inherited traits, or what we may call the design, and pertinent environmental experiences, or what may be called learning. So, it is a complex combination of the design and learning process. Let us first trace the origin of the word intelligence itself, just to understand how people looked at it over thousands of years. It is thought to be derived from Latin words intelligentia or intellectus, which themselves in turn are derived from the verb intelligere, meaning to comprehend or perceive. This is the basic kernel from which current word of intelligence is being coined. And as you can see, there itself lies the real meaning of intelligence, that to comprehend or perceive. And please note, the comprehend and perceive themselves are complex words which are quite loaded in terms of how they are to be interpreted in various contexts. If you look at initially, the intelligence was linked to metaphysical and cosmological theories, and as such, in the initial phases of its development, it was treated like a philosophy and was a subject of study under philosophy. Of course, at some stage this was disputed and the intelligence became a subject of the discipline of psychology. So, even today the intelligence as a kind of an attribute is being researched and studied in the field of psychology. Of course, this goes without saying that in spite of enormous amount of research, studies, intelligence has not found a single comprehensive explanation, and that has been its major problem, resulting in varied interpretations in multiple contexts. All of those interpretations correct, and this multi-valued interpretation also leads to issues of how to interpret, how to implement these things in machines. So, if we were to look at intelligence as an attribute, it itself is understood differently by different thinkers. There are multiple interpretations. All of them are not only valid, but are also applicable in some context. So, that we need to keep all of those as possible solutions to the question of what is intelligence. For example, you must have heard these words. Somebody would call it good sense, judgment, rational thinking, goal directed adaptive behavior, capacity to modify cognitive functions, and so on. There will be so many words, all of them ultimately trying to define what is meant by intelligence. Intelligence can mean good sense, it can mean rational thinking, it can mean capacity to modify cognitive functions, and all of these. In fact, there have been also instances where intelligence has been defined as a problem solving skill, process of acquiring, storing, retrieving, combining, comparing, using in new context information and conceptual skills. So, if we use information or if we acquire information, if we store information, retrieve it, combine, compare, use in a new context, all that is being termed as intelligence. And intelligence is not only limited to the human, even though we are going to focus more on the human intelligence scenario, it is all around us. But among all the forms of intelligence that is available in the natural world, human intelligence stands out as the main type of intelligence that all of us possess, though to varying degree and of different types. So, this is something which is very fundamental to all of us are intelligent. So, when we tell somebody or that this person is not intelligent, it is not correct. All of us possess intelligence. Of course, it could be to varying degree or of a different type. We are nobody to judge what is correct, what is not correct. We just accept the intelligence for what it manifests itself in different humans. And it has been recognized by psychologists that human intelligence essentially consists of complex cognitive feats, motivation and self-awareness. You will find that this is coming perhaps the closest to what intelligence might be in the context of humans, that it involves carrying out complex cognitive feats, having motivation and also being self-aware. And these aspects of intelligence they result in our abilities to learn, form concepts, understand and reason, recognize patterns, plan, solve problems and employ languages to communicate. Please note, an extremely important skill set is the language, that is again being driven by our whole intelligence package. We continue further in opening up this human intelligence scenario, and we find that people have recognized it as being different from learning. Learning is only one of the aspects of intelligence, but by itself it is not intelligence. Learning is being defined, I think people have looked at it and then come up with this interpretation that it is mainly an act of retaining facts, information and recalling them later for future applications. It is the applications which ultimately bring in the concept of intelligence. The learning is essentially an act of retaining facts, storing information and recalling them later for future applications. So, it is one of the skill set that makes up for intelligence. In fact, even today and for all the earlier times, there has been a raging debate concerning the facts whether the intelligence is inherited or is based on environmental factors, though evidence points to both being contributors, which means nobody can say that intelligence is all inherited, even though sometime in our interaction in a social context, we do make such assertions that your hereditary or your lineage gives you intelligence. There have been sufficient studies, research and evidence to show that it is a complex combination of what you inherit through your genes and what comes from your basic environmental factors, learning, etc. In fact, for a very long time people have been devising tests to measure the intelligence. I am sure many of you would remember the IQ test, which used to be very popular in 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But most people currently are now skeptical about their ability to correctly measure an entity that defies a single description. How can you measure quantitatively something which does not even have a correct or a single description? Which means you are going to be having only a very, very limited perspective when you talk about IQ as the measure of intelligence. In fact, people have been talking about EQ, emotional quotient. There are many other kind of tests that people are talking about to measure different kind of skill sets and type of intelligence. So, it is all a mix and match of everything else. In fact, now there is also a general agreement that there are multiple types of intelligence apart from basic human type that are also present and manifest themselves in different contexts. For example, people talk about emotional intelligence as I talk about EQ, social intelligence, moral intelligence, which exhibit different types of skill sets. In fact, you will realize that these are all equally applicable and there could be many more that we have not even been able to kind of extract and identify. Lot of people have social skills, they are good in groups, they can work well within the teams. There are people who are loners, so you can clearly see that there is a difference. And people also have carried out scientific studies to investigate animal cognition and have extensively researched dog intelligence. other non-human species such as apes, chimps, dolphins, elephants. So, people are now talking about intelligence of different kinds. In fact, now some of the people have come to believe that even plants are also intelligent species. Of course, there are always detractors. So, the supporters of this theory claim that plants have the ability to sense and model their external and internal environment and adjust their morphology, physiology and phenotype for self preservation. You can see the kind of trees, the plants that grow in rainforest, in desert areas, in hilly terrain, in mountainous region, in snow areas, they are all different. And these supporters say that it is the plant's ability to modify their internal structure, morphology, that is some kind of plant intelligence. However, detractors say that the plants do not have the ability to create or use memories. They say that memory is an important part of intelligence. So, this debate will continue probably even into the future. We conclude this segment by saying that, or accepting the fact that intelligence is going to be extremely difficult to define in a complete manner in a general sense. Though specific descriptions do exist that explain different aspects, and please note, we have to get this intelligence into a machine. So, obviously, a thing which can't even be defined, it is not going to be very easy to put it in the same level in a machine. So, obviously, we are going to have to kind of downgrade our expectations. We will see that as we go along. So, with that, we come to the end of this segment, and we will probe this aspect further in the subsequent lectures. So, bye for now. Thank you and see you in the next lecture.